everyone, this is Stan, and I have today's internet weather. So the internet weather is how we study threats on the internet or different cyber threats. Specifically, one of the things we'll look at is scanning activity. Scanning activity is a great way to measure reconnaissance or what different adversaries are used to. So what I have in front of me right now is the top 10 most probed ports report. So this is us measuring scanning activity by looking at how much scanning is going on in a particular port by volume and ranking it against the scanning activity against all of the ports. And if we look at the list, these are the same ports we cover pretty much every week. The one that looked interesting to me was port 9530. Even though it's down a few places from last week, I hadn't looked at this one for a while, and I thought it was interesting, so I wanted to share with you kind of what we see happening here. This here actually is a view, a 30-day view of scan activity on port 9530 TCP. And you can see something interesting. So the volume of scanning, it's not a great deal. It's in the, looks like millions or 180 million flow records per hour. But it started sometime, I guess maybe 15 days ago or something like that, maybe 20 days ago. And you could see how the activity is actually ramped up, possibly as more victims became compromised or something like that. You could also see these little parts here where maybe the activity first started on this port or started again. So with activity like this, it's always interesting to see what it might be attributed to. So looking at one of the ways to do that is by looking at like who is doing the activity, like who is doing the scanning. Is it a security researcher? Is there a few devices? Is there a lot? And you could see something interesting here. So there's not a ton of scanners. Actually, if you look, the activity, just like we noticed in the report, the activity is trending downward by how many devices are doing the scanning. But you could see that earlier in the month, there were definite spikes. And you could see possibly as more devices became recruited into the botnet or to this threat, the number of devices conducting the scanning had increased. So stuff like this, you guys know me, I'm always interested to find out like what are the devices behind the scanning? What are they? Where are they located? And maybe what's causing it? So I took a list of about 700 or so IP addresses that are scanning within the last 2 hours. And I decided to superimpose that on the map here. I like to do this because it kind of shows like hotspots of activity potentially and where the threat might be emanating from. If you've been looking at these maps for a while, you'll notice that some threats might originate out of like Asia, others out of Europe, others out of the Middle East or South America. So I find it very useful to kind of take a look here. So with only 718 IP addresses, it's a little hard to measure specific hotspots, but you could actually see that there is definite hotspots like in Korea and I think that's Japan and definitely some there in the, I guess, Europe or Middle East, South America. But it seems like by the previous chart, this threat is both growing and already shrinking. So there's definitely a bunch of devices infected, maybe 1,000 or maybe 2,000, but it's not like hundreds of thousands like with some of the other threats that we see. So what does it all mean? So I tried to do a little bit of research on this port. We actually did cover this on ThreatTraq probably even a few years ago when it first surfaced. But it turns out that this is just reminding myself, this is a threat that impacts specific chipsets, so high silicon chips running a specific version of firmware. It was discovered by a security researcher in 2018. There's a CVE that's associated with it. And basically, connecting to this port allows you to open up another port where you can then log in with a backdoor credential, basically, like an administrative credential. It gives you full administrative command line access to the device. These devices are DVRs. So one of the things I did is that from the 700 IP addresses, I picked like random IP addresses, a few dozen, and I kind of looked at them up in Showdown just to see what ports are commonly open there. And it looks like most of the devices that are scanning do have port 554 TCP and port 9000 TCP open. And port 554 TCP is RTSP, which again, it comes back to these probably likely being DVRs as described in this CVE. So most likely this threat is spreading or re-spreading again, basically looking for additional devices that they can recruit into their botnet, possibly for things like DDoS, like we talked before.
I think that's what they make is DVRs and cameras, right? I think that's their big market.
Yes, exactly. And actually, if you read this, I think it's a ZDNet article or some of the other articles on this topic, you'll actually see that there's a list of like hundreds of DVRs that are like white labeled or something like that. They're basically rebranded versions of this DVR system underneath, and they're all vulnerable. So you might think like, oh, I don't have a high silicon, DVR, but you might. So just be, I guess for people who might have a DVR, you should be careful how you deploy it. Definitely be careful how you expose it on the internet, in your own network. It might be good to be able to monitor your DVR remotely, but just make sure you understand which ports you're exposing, and don't expose all of the ports, or don't put your DVR right on the DMZ. Be very careful how you configure your network settings. There's a lot of very powerful options there that you just don't want to make a mistake on. So moving on, this is actually a similar type of report as before, and this one's a little more closely tied into the botnet activity, because this is looking for concerted scanning all on the same port by many, many devices at once. And we'll also use this as a measure of botnet activity. So a lot of these ports, again, we've covered many times. They're very well known. There's a lot of people looking for them, not because they're necessarily part of a botnet, but because these are good, top 10 ports you might scan. So the ports that we usually concentrate on for further analysis are ones that wouldn't be, in the top 10, that might represent a threat. And port 8291 TCP and actually port 8728 TCP represent two such ports. They're kind of just a little weird. They're not the ones that are enabled by default, like in most scanning software. So it just makes sense to look at them a little bit closer. Now, we've looked at these before on ThreatTraq, and the activity, if you look at it, is actually down from the activity we were seeing even 2 weeks ago. But you could see there's still tens of thousands of IP addresses scanning on these ports and looking for a vulnerability. And again, we already know what this vulnerability is. We've talked about it a few times on ThreatTraq, but this is basically the MikroTik exploit. I think it was also discovered in 2018. So port 8291 is associated with Winbox, which is a management interface for MikroTik routers. It's not, I don't believe it's intended to be open on the internet interface. It's probably intended to be open on the LAN. But for some reason, I guess there might be some of these devices that are deployed in a way that allows this management interface to be open on the internet. So unfortunately, what that allows is for various adversaries, including possibly this botnet, to take advantage of these MikroTik routers. Now, this one, just like the other, is very, very similar. You connect on port 8291, send a special packet, and it opens up a back door, and you can log in with some well-known credentials, let's say. You can SSH with well-known credentials, or you can maybe telnet with well-known credentials. So there's actually multiple different CVEs that impact this, but this is one that kind of recently popped on the radar for, kind of very interesting one to look at. And I just noted that that one of the exploits, CVE 2018-14847, can be detected with this emerging threat snort rule. So in case anyone is running MikroTik and you guys have a chance to deploy snort rules, this will show you which devices are attempting to do exploitation activity against your router. But honestly, you should just make sure that this port is not open on the internet for your router. This should really be something that's only exposed on the LAN side and not on the internet side. So do be careful of that. That will probably be better.
I mean, the only thing that I would say here is that these MikroTik routers, unfortunately, I think we've done so many different stories on these devices. It's surprising to me how often, and I'm not on this show all the time, and it seems like every other time I'm on, we're talking about these MikroTik routers. So it's just it's disconcerting how frequently we actually see stories about vulnerabilities that are found in these particular routers. And
yeah, Manny, that's very interesting because MikroTik is actually, we've seen some other botnets actually leverage MikroTik devices for part of their infrastructure. So it's definitely important. If you do have a MikroTik router, make sure it's up to date, but really just make sure that you're not exposing management interfaces on any device you manage. You should not, there should be no router or F5 or DVR or any other appliance that you put the management interface of that appliance on the internet, because that basically leads to problems. Anything from brute forcing all the way through, obviously remote code execution, which, it also leaves your internal network vulnerable, because once somebody has access to your router, kind of game over, unfortunately for you, because they can see everything that's coming in and out of your basically connection. So that's an important point to keep in mind.
Yeah, I just had to look it up because I was curious on that same point, Manny. It's I don't hear a lot of MikroTik. Of course, the bigger companies you see, the Junipers, the Ciscos, even the Huaweis. You see the big router names, and I think in MikroTik, and then it's a Latvian company, and they make a lot of stuff for the hobbyist. It seems like that's a lot of the stuff that they're doing is the smaller companies, smaller things, and a lot of stuff for do-it-yourselfers.
So with that, that's kind of it for the Internet Weather this week. If any of our viewers have any suggestions or recommendations, or if you know something more about these ports that are engaged in scanning, do let us know. You can use the comments below. You can reach out to us on our mailing list, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks, everyone.